Hello, everyone. This is World Review with Ivo Daalder, a weekly look at news from around the world produced by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Another Friday, this one, April 12th. And this week, we had a lot of interesting things, some good, some not so good, some who knows. So here goes. First, President Biden welcomed Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida to Washington for a state visit. The two long-standing allies signaled a series of new movements forward. They signed a whole bunch of agreements cementing their relationship, I would argue, to a new high. Perhaps the U.S.-Japan alliance is now becoming the cornerstone, as some have said, of America's engagement in the Indo-Pacific. Both leaders also met with President Marcos of the Philippines, and they pledged that to have an open and free South China Sea is in everyone's interest. And of course, that South China Sea is increasingly treated by Beijing as a South China Lake that Beijing controls. So how was the meeting received, or that set of meetings received in Washington, in Tokyo, in Manila, and in Beijing? Then we'll take a look, speaking of Beijing, of Treasury Secretary Yellen's visit to Beijing and Guangzhou, where she went for the second time in 2 years to have serious conversations about economics. And those conversations are serious because the two super economies, China and the United States, are still the foundation of the global economy, but they are increasingly having tense relationships with the United States, putting all kinds of export controls on what China can and cannot control, and China using its large export market as a way to rejuvenate its own economy. And finally, Gaza. Israeli troops have mostly withdrawn from Gaza. Just one brigade remains, cutting off the north from the south. And at the same time, aid levels are starting to reach the kind of levels they should have been reaching on a daily basis since October 7th. 400, sometimes 500 trucks are making it into Gaza. Question is, did the Israeli Prime Minister finally heed the warning from Washington? Or is this just a temporary thaw and things will soon go back to where they were with more war and a worse humanitarian situation? Here to talk about all three of these issues are three reporters that covered the story. First is Ken Moriyasu, who is the Washington correspondent for Nikkei Asia and joins us here for the first time. Prashant Rao, senior editor at Semaphore, joins us from London. Carla Anne Robbins, a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and co-host of CSR's The World Next Week, joins us from New York. All three, welcome. Wonderful to have you. Ken, as I said, wonderful to have you on the program. You're a Chicagoan, but have been reporting from Tokyo and for Nikkei for a long time. Let's start with you. A very important visit with the Japanese Prime Minister, signing multiple agreements, but really cementing the relationship between the United States and Japan to a new level. Tell us what you thought was achieved at the summit, and how do you think Tokyo is reacting to the news that has come out of the visit this week?
All right. Thanks, Ivo. Thanks for having me. I think there are 4 takeaways from the visit. I'll start with the first one about how important Japan is as an ally. You said that you described it as a long-standing ally and perhaps cementing the alliance and Japan being the cornerstone of the Indo-Pacific. I think I would go a little bit further. It may be controversial, but this summit may be remembered as the time when Japan became America's most important ally, overtaking the UK. That's for geographical reasons and the fact that China is the number one pacing threat, and Japan happens to be right next to China. That's number one. Number two, I think Kishida's message to Biden and also the Congress was that I know that there is self-doubt in America. America is exhausted from all these wars, and there is this hint of isolationism, this desire to look inward. But America doesn't have to do it alone. Japan is with you. Australia is with you, South Korea is with you, the Philippines is with you. Let's try a new approach. Let's try a lattice work of the existing alliances, and let's defend the international order together. That's the second point. The third point is that there is much more clarity now in Japan's path forward. Many people compare Shinzo Abe and Fumio Kishida, and they say that Fumio Kishida is a successor to the path that Abe laid. I think there's much more clarity now. Abe was more about juggling Russia, China, North Korea, and Japan to have the most strategically best position for Japan. Kishida is much more clear in that it's firmly in the US camp, and it's not trying to balance any of that. And the reason why there is so much clarity is because Japan, I think, has come to a conclusion on Xi Jinping. They've seen Xi Jinping for 12 years now. They don't need to see him anymore. They know what he is. And therefore, they have made a decision to form a strategy that is not about engagement. It's about defending the international rules-based order. And if China is willing to play with the rules, then there'll be negotiations and engagement with China. If China wants to create a new order, then Japan is not going to deal with that. The fourth one is that the whole visit was all about one man, and that one man was not Joe Biden, it's Donald Trump. And Japan's strategy here is to be as close to America as possible, so that if Trump does come back, Japan believes that this is the safest way to handle a second Trump administration. That is to reach out to Congress, to have bipartisan support for Japan-US relations. And today, Kishida is in North Carolina visiting Japanese factories there. The message here is that Japan has relations with the 50 states, and the governors and the state legislatures support the Japanese alliance, support the business with all this investment. Japan is the number one FDI investor in America for 4 consecutive years. So I think by emphasizing the relationship with the states of America, that is also a preparation to deal with Trump.
Ken, I think that those 4 points are really sum it up well, and gives it a strategic coherence to Japanese policy that is novel, as indeed in some ways is the way that Japan has been behaving in the last few years, doubling its defense spending, really declaring its alliances with the United States and other countries in the Indo-Pacific, making it clear that it knows where the threats are and also where the opportunities lie. And the way you describe that is extremely well thought out. I guess, Prashant, just to start off with you, you're in London. To British ears to hear the idea that there is another country in the world, at least not in Europe, but another country in the world that is actually the more important ally. How do the Brits look at that? You think, and how do you? I mean, Britain, of course, has global, including Indo-Pacific desires and intentions. Can they look at this as a plus, or are they going to look at this in a win-lose kind of way when they think about alliances and the relationship with the United States?
Well, first, I just want to say, listening to Kishida's speech before the joint session of Congress, it was striking to hear a non-American leader basically espouse the American dream so clearly and succinctly, and in such a sort of powerful speech in which, he talked about the rules-based order, all the things that the United States has really sort of tried to drive for generations. And it's obviously not lost that there's a lot of people in that Congress who do not seem to agree. And that's obviously why he made that speech the way he did. But I was very struck by that. In terms of the UK, the Atlantic, where I worked previously, we did a story about Boris Johnson in 2021, where he apparently said to Joe Biden that he didn't want to call it a special relationship anymore because it made Britain sound needy. And that is very much, Britain always wants the special relationship to be the first thing Americans say. So to hear someone like Ken say that there might be someone more important, it's heartbreaking from a British point of view, but at the same time, I think, in all honesty, I do think countries like Britain see Japan's stance as hugely net positive for a couple of reasons. One, obviously, we've seen the reports in the past few days of AUKUS, the defense sharing alliance between the US, Australia, and the UK, increasingly contemplating adding Japan at one way or another. I think also, though, the remarks that Kishida made in DC about Ukraine really speak to this broader, I think, Biden foreign policy sense that this is not a European war, that this is actually a global war in which everyone has a stake. And a leader of Japan saying so has huge, I think, rhetorical power that extends this war beyond simply, a sort of concern of the West. Now, reasonable people can disagree as to whether or not it is a sort of narrow concern of the West only, but I think that was hugely powerful in terms of just the rhetorical power of, a country that frankly has, in this extremely narrow definition, no sort of territorial stake in this, but it has a real sort of stake, as he said, in the rules-based international order, and Ukraine's importance extends far beyond the narrow geographic confines of the war.
I think all smart perspectives here, Prashant, and just Carla. I'm struck by Kent's. I mean, for one, comment on anything you've heard, of course, but I'm struck by Kent's second point. All four were well taken, but this idea that Japan was coming forward and actually, given with the doubling of defense spending, will be the third largest defense power in the world. Saying that we bear responsibility as allies of the United States of upholding this world order. Prashant's point on Ukraine, that in fact, this is not something that is just happening far away. It affects us in real, fundamental ways. Are we seeing perhaps the beginnings of an era in which America's strongest and most important allies in both the Indo-Pacific and in the North Atlantic, Euro-Atlantic area are stepping up, and Europeans are spending more on defense. They're taking more willingness to helping on Ukraine, but stepping up and saying, this international order from which we have benefited so much, that has been led by the United States, we need to step up and do our part in maintaining it, particularly since it's not really clear we can rely on the United States to do this forever. And you know what? We're up to that task. How do you see that? Is that part of what you're hearing and starting to hear?
Well, certainly you're hearing it. In Europe, you're hearing it. Ivo, you know this better than I do. You're hearing it more out of panic than out of intent, because of the concern that the U.S. is not going to be there if Trump is elected, and more than anything else, because we could lose Ukraine within months, because if the U.S. doesn't pass the aid. You look at what the Czechs are doing. They're trying to, raise money, within Europe so they can buy enough artillery shells on the global market, because the U.S. is dropping the ball itself. So a lot of what's happening in Europe is panic, but I think a certain self-awareness as well. But they also know that it's going to take a really long time to get there, and they don't know if they have enough time to do it, to make up the gap for Ukraine, and also to make up the gap if Donald Trump is elected. I think, one other point that Ken made that I think is really striking is the notion of this lattice work. I always am very spoken hub, lattice work, all the ways they talk about this. But this notion that the Biden administration has, and this notion that Kishida has, that they're trying to create some sort of structures that perhaps will exist after, if President Biden loses and President Trump comes back, that will possibly survive another 4 years of this typhoon of Trump. And one in which, if the United States is not actively there, that we can push forward, or at least limp forward, and that this sort of strategic notion is shared between the Japanese and the Americans. And the Europeans, are talking that way as well. But I think the Europeans, people, this better than I do. I think the Europeans don't have as much confidence that they can do it. And it seems that Kishida seems to think that they have more confidence.
Yeah, it's certainly striking in the confidence, Ken, that Kishida showed when he was here. And I wonder, his domestic situation is one of incredible weakness, has nothing to do with this part of his conversation. But I talk a little bit about how people in Tokyo and in the rest of the country were looking at this visit. Was this seen as oh my God, it's great. Japan is stepping up. It's taking responsibilities. It's doing things, and it's well regarded and welcomed on the global scene? Or is it more, wait a minute, are we taking on responsibilities that, in fact, we don't really want to? We're very happy with where we've been for the last 70 years. How does this play out domestically in Japan?
Well, the best indicator for that, I think, is to look at the opposition parties of Japan and their defense policies and what they're saying. I don't hear many opposition leaders coming out and saying, "What a terrible visit! What is Kishida getting us into?" That's not what they're saying. All their defense policies are very much close to the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP, in that Japan has to increase its defense spending, has to have some kind of counter-street capability, has to take part in this united effort, joint effort to defend the international order, especially in the region. So in that case, I don't think there is much a disconnect among the people. And that's all to my point about China and Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping's China. So the issue with Xi Jinping's path is that he doesn't want to reform China to make China adaptable to the international order. He wants to change the international order so that it fits China. So that kind of mentality comes from this desire to justify this Chinese Communist Party rule. And because China, he talks about rejuvenation of the great Chinese people. There was a time when China was the central empire of the world. He wants to go back to that kind of situation. So that translates into might is right. We're big, so therefore we have a say. And that kind of world is very dangerous for Japan. And I think that's why Japan has clarity in its path forward. That vision of a China-led Indo-Pacific is not comfortable for Japan. And since that decision has been made, the American first element in America is very troubling. If America isn't willing to maintain the international order, that's very troubling for Japan. So I think that Kishida is putting all its chips into this path.
And I think that's exactly right. And Prashant, that's maybe a good segue to our second topic, because clearly the area in which, on the one hand, China has sought to transform itself and be part of an international order, and at the same time is trying to change that international order in a way that fits China's interest, is in the economy. And you saw that in some ways in the duality of the message that Janet Yellen brought to her second official visit to China. On the one hand, welcoming and making clear that there's no interest in decoupling and nor an interest in deglobalization. There's an interest in trade, and the two countries are very much dependent on the other. And on the other hand, saying, "Hey, listen, you guys are not playing by the rules, and that doesn't work for us." How did you see the visit overall? What struck you most about the messages that both she was delivering and I guess she was hearing in return?
So I guess so much of what you take away from Yellen's visit to China depends on how much weight you attach to improving rhetoric. And that, I don't mean to sort of downplay that. It is hugely important. The rhetorical relationship between the United States and China had gotten so bad as recently a year ago. I mean, it's easy to forget now, given how it was just a year ago or 14 months ago that a spy balloon was flying over the mainland United States, and Antony Blinken canceled the trip to China. And diplomatic relations just couldn't get any worse because Pelosi had got to Taiwan, and everything seemed just in a relentless downward spiral. So just the fact that she went, just the fact that she was able to have these conversations, other sort of softer indicators, the fact that, Chinese state media humanized her, which is highly unusual now, that a U.S. official can go to China and be shown doing normal things like eating at a restaurant and drinking beer in state media is actually, an underrated positive because it shows that, this is not, an evil country to this, in the official Chinese press, which is a marked difference. So there are real kind of positives that we can take away from this trip. And, there are huge numbers of things that may result from this that are tangible improvements. The fact remains, though, I think that there are just huge structural differences between these two countries. And regardless of any improvement in rhetoric between the United States and China, the fact remains that, these two countries want very different things from the international system. Whatever you may think of China's economic policy, its arguable, coercion and expansionism in the South China Sea, all these various things, territorial disputes, to say nothing of Xinjiang and litany of other issues, territorial disputes with India. The fact is they have very different worldviews, and that will not be reconciled through a Treasury Secretary's visit or an upcoming visit of, Blinken to Beijing. There are real tangible issues. And, I think one of the things that is interesting also to keep in mind is I think it can be very easy after, the visits of the Philippine and Japanese leaders to Washington to believe that Asia is on the American side against a, kind of revanchist China that is like making all these territorial expansionist moves. But actually, survey data seems to indicate that most of ASEAN is shifting to be more pro-China than more pro-United States. There are several key Middle Eastern countries that are shifting to be more pro-China than pro-United States. Parts of Latin America are increasingly pro-China. And it can be very easy. And, of course, Japan is a significant ally to have in, this kind of rivalry with China. But it should not be understated that, the Philippines is now a rare country in Southeast Asia that is markedly pro-United States. And that is in part a legacy of, Donald Trump. It's a legacy of several different factors. But I think one of the ways to think of these two stories in tandem of Japanese and Philippine leaders' visits to Washington and Janet Yellen's trip to Beijing is that actually in large parts of Asia, this is still up for grabs. People's views are not as anti-China as I think DC thinks they are, and that would be a note of caution I would send.
I think, Carla, I think Prashant's point is extraordinarily well taken, and it sort of plays directly into a bigger argument we're having in Washington about how to treat the Chinese, because in some ways the Yellen approach was to say, listen, we know that there are countries out there who are telling us, please don't make us choose between you and the Chinese, because you, as the Singaporean Prime Minister once said, you may not like the answer. And that's true in Africa, it's true in Latin America, it's true in ASEAN countries. And therefore, the Biden approach has sort of let's try to have a working relationship with China while drawing some very strong lines on the national security side. There are others, and we just had a major article in your council's magazine, Foreign Affairs, by Matt Pottinger and Mike Gallagher, the outgoing chair of the Committee on the Chinese Communist Party, saying, no, our policy shouldn't be win-win. Our policy should be we win, they must lose, and people need to choose. And that is a very, a big debate here in Washington that seems to ignore where is the rest of the world lining up, and don't we want them to be on our side?
Well, it's interesting that the Biden administration, of course, came in with this notion that we could compete with them in certain areas and we could be in conflict with them in other areas. And they got, quite shrill in what areas, and then were surprised that this wasn't working, that the Chinese didn't think that we could pick and choose. And so they've certainly ratcheted back the rhetoric. I suppose I, more than anything else, have a question, which is, how do the Chinese look at this? The balance seems to be better. And then you have Donald Trump coming out and he says that he's going to come in and he's going to impose tariffs of 60% or higher on the Chinese, and 10% tariffs across the board. Things that he is talking about doing. They may want countries to choose, but the impact of that on the global economy should not be minimized. A lot of things that I hear in Latin America, my old stomping ground, is that countries, if they think they're choosing, it's mainly because the United States isn't showing up. The Chinese see this competition, whether it's at the UN and lots of other countries that we consider obscure. The Chinese have showed up again and again and again over years after years after years in places that we just didn't pay attention to. So part of the competition isn't just showing up and saying you've got to choose. A lot of it is just showing up. So I would throw it to Prashant and to Ken and ask them, how much are they? We know how Kishida is looking at the potential of a threat of Trump. How are the Chinese looking at a threat of Trump when Trump says 60% or higher? for tariffs? I mean, I don't take Yellen's threat of tariffs particularly seriously because the impact on the U.S. economy and inflation would be enormous. How seriously are they taking the Trump threats?
Prashant, any sense of how do you think the Chinese are looking at this? I mean, I'm taking that one of the reasons the relationship is turned is because clearly the Chinese would like Biden to stay. It's better to bedevil you know than the devil you really know in some ways. But Prashant, how do you think it looks?
I will sort of put up humility. If I knew what Xi Jinping thought about this kind of thing, I would not be appearing on this podcast. But in all honesty, I do think one of the things that...
But you can opine about it. That's why you are.
What would you be doing if you knew what Xi Jinping thought about it?
I would probably be making some investments that would mean that I could retire early.
Okay.
Yeah, right. Ken, I mean, you've described a pretty stark view now in Japan, which I recognize of Xi Jinping. And at the same time, I do think most Japanese, and I think the Japanese government recognizes that there is an economic relationship with China that can't end. It is fundamental to the strength of the Japanese and the global economy. How do you see Japan balancing this question of how do you maintain at least an economic relationship, good relations with ASEAN, where clearly their dependence economically on China is even bigger than that of Japan or the United States. How do you see Japan playing that balancing act?
Right. So for many years, Japan had this dual track policy where security and politics were aligned with America, but the business was aligned with China. And they thought that they could have it both ways. But I would say in the past 4 or 5 years, maybe, there's an understanding on the Japanese side that Japan has to decouple. People don't say it because it's not politically correct. But the answer is clear. Japan has to decouple from China, especially in the high-tech world, because the Pentagon believes that the next potential war with China would be very different from past wars in that it will be decided in the opening minutes. And how it will be decided is that both sides will be trying to take down satellites. The Chinese will try to take down the GPS and then negate all the advantages that the American military has, all the communications between the missiles, the tanks, the planes. And once that communication is down, China will have a chance at winning that war. So if that's the thinking, I think there has been a concerted effort on the American side to remove Chinese gadgets from all the infrastructure so that on day one of the next war, all China has to do is to switch on a button and all these devices work to take down the GPS. So they want to prevent that. And if that's America's path, because Japan depends its security 100% on America, there is no path for Japan to say, well, America can do that, but we're going to maintain our business relations with China, because that's not going to work. So in terms of high-tech, Japan, there is zero new investments from Japanese companies into China in high-tech. So that's clear. Japan will continue to do business like making T-shirts, selling coffee, Japanese restaurants, that's fine. But there is definitely a decoupling happening in the tech world, I think.
I think the other thing, just to hit on something, Ivo, that you and Carla talked about, is the point of showing up is something that Southeast Asia brought up a lot when Pompeo was Secretary of State. And, I think it remains an issue is even when the Americans do show up, they frame everything in the U.S.-China rivalry. And nothing is just about the country that they are talking to. Everything is about, a almost George W. Bush-esque, are you with us or are you against us kind of worldview. And I think that is something that the State Department, the White House, I imagine, are trying to change. But at the same time, yes, it's important to show up to an APEC summit, which President Biden didn't do a couple times. But it's also important to treat those issues with these partner countries on their own and not in a grand framing. Whether or not you believe it's part of a grand framing, I think that becomes incredibly insulting to the countries that you're dealing with, that we only want to deal with you because you are a potential ally or rival in our broader war, or broader competition, strategic or otherwise, with China.
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. is not very good on subtle diplomacy. That's always been sort of the case, and I say that as that's not true for the diplomats. They're incredibly subtle, but it's the U.S. writ large. Since I'm about to have dinner with two very good American diplomats who are very subtle when it comes to these kinds of things. But I think the point is well made, and just to Carla, to emphasize your point on showing up. I think when you talk to your old stomping grounds in Latin America, I think one is, you guys aren't here and the Chinese are, so you're not giving us a choice. But the other is, when you are here, it usually is talking about things that are not uppermost in our minds. And there are things uppermost in our minds you don't seem to care a lot about, whether it is our economic, finding ways to improve our economic relations with the United States, or many internal issues that the U.S. has either mishandled or not, or it doesn't handle. So, I mean, my sense is the same kind of complaint that Prashant had writ large of how the U.S. behaves is doubly so in Latin America.
Although I wouldn't overstate, I will tell you that in my other hat, which is teaching, I don't have to make this case in my class. I say to my students, mainly the ones who come from Africa, how many of you come from places where there are Chinese factories in your country? And they raise their hand and they say, how do you feel about having the Chinese there? And none of them were enthusiastic, because these factories come in and they don't employ local people. So the Chinese, let's not overstate it, okay? I mean, the Chinese don't make a particularly good case for themselves when they're on the ground.
Absolutely true. Absolutely true. But sometimes you don't have the alternative, because there's nobody. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a factory at all. And that is kind of the situation that we face. Let's shift over to. It'd be hard to do an entire week without Gaza, and we have to talk about Gaza. Just a fascinating week, Carla. The decision on after we're now 6 months into the war. Over 6 months in the war, and on the day that the 6 months day, the Israelis withdrew their last combat battalion. There's one brigade left, which is holding the line between the north and the south. And all of a sudden, you see A trucks coming in at double the level that they were at the height even a week ago. Are things changing, or are we just in a lull?
Well, Ambassador, and you're about to have dinner with two ambassadors. So when you were praising ambassadors, let's praise you as an ambassador, Eva. So the UN will dispute those numbers. The UN has completely different numbers from what the Israelis are saying. They say there's no increase in the daily average of trucks going into Gaza in the first week of April. That may be a counting issue. The way the Israelis count the absolute number of trucks. What they do is, when the trucks come in and they go through the trucks and they take out a lot of stuff. And so they come in basically half empty, and the UN then counts. So the trucks come in and they take half empty, and then they fill them up full. So this may be an accounting issue, but the UN says ultimately they don't take the Israeli numbers, that there's a significantly higher number coming in. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, Bibi made two commitments to Biden when Biden said, I'm going to condition future aid. I'm not sure that Bibi believed him. I'm not sure if Biden believed himself, but we'll see. Unless you improve the humanitarian situation, Bibi made a commitment to open the port of Ashdod, which has yet to be opened. He also pledged to open the Erez crossing, which doesn't appear it's ever going to be opened because there's a building lying there. Now the Israelis are saying they're going to open another crossing into northern Gaza near Zakin that hasn't been opened yet, at least according to reporting a day and a half ago. So maybe it's getting better, but all the reporting on the ground, both from the Israelis and from American reporters who were talking to people, is that it's not significantly better yet. Did Bibi blink? I think maybe the biggest test is Rafah, and that's the thing the Americans were also really worried about. Everyone says it's going to be a disaster if they go into Rafah on the ground. Bibi said earlier in the week that he's got a date. And then, the Israeli defense minister told Lloyd Austin, don't pay attention to him. So I think the big tests are going to be whether or not those trucks numbers are really going up and whether or not they go into Rafah.
I did notice, Prashant, that Tony Blinken in a press conference that he did this week, he said, he mentioned 500 trucks as well, but he said, in the end, that doesn't matter. All we care about is results. And so far, the results aren't there yet. I think Sam Power, the USAID administrator, was there and declared that what's happening in the north is a famine. There's real hunger in some ways, and ultimately, of course, nothing's going to change. Even however positive developments are, the underground reality can't change within a week. But when you look at it all and you hear, Carla's views on what the UN is saying and others. Are we dealing with a feint here that is designed for PR, or is it, or do you think there's a real fundamental shift in Israeli policy?
I'm fairly. I'm not very confident this is a fundamental shift in Israeli policy. Not because nobody wants it to shift, but also the domestic Israeli politics of this suggests it's highly unlikely that it's advantageous for Netanyahu to shift. Were he to shift, his far right members of his cabinet have already said that they will withdraw support for his coalition government without an invasion of Rafah. I think there is, some analysis out there that actually what Netanyahu is trying to do is play a game of four-dimensional chess in which he keeps Rafah out as a sort of an option for some indeterminate point in the future. A date has been set to placate his far right flank. While never actually following through and being able to sort of hold out that, the Americans are holding me back, and all these things. I think perhaps that's the case, but I am uncertain that there will be a fundamental shift otherwise in this war that will tangibly change what is happening in Gaza, simply because the nature of Netanyahu's incentives drive him towards this war continuing, at least at some level, because we're to stop. We've already seen, several senior Israeli politicians call for new elections. Netanyahu's polling has been for several months, despite the war itself being popular with Israelis. Netanyahu's own popularity is incredibly low double digits, high single digits in a lot of polling. And so all of these factors, regardless of what what Washington may hope is happening, I just don't think the domestic Israeli political situation drives him towards changing his strategy. And so absent a major shift domestically, I cannot see a significant shift in this war.
Can I just jump here? There are two other factors to consider. And one is, if the Iranians hit Israel, and the Americans are warning that it could come in the next 2 days, that's going to completely change the dynamic between the U.S. and Israel. And the Americans are running around trying to get everyone to stop that, including talking to the Chinese about it, trying to put pressure on Tehran. And the second thing is that CIA Director Bill Burns is supposed to be delivering a new proposal over the weekend to negotiators in Cairo, trying to secure some sort of a ceasefire and hostage deal. And the most chilling thing that we're hearing is that Hamas is saying they don't have 40 living hostages to come up with. So these are two major dynamics that have an impact that could shift everyone's attention completely away from Gaza and the humanitarian concern.
Yeah, no, I think both well taken, and just shows that the complexity of that issue. Ken, I want to come to you because you've now been in Washington for about 6 months since you arrived here as the Washington bureau chief of Nikkei Asia. And you no doubt have seen in the 6 months that Gaza is taking an incredible amount of energy and focus in U.S. politics and U.S. description. And I just wonder, one, on your own reflection on how you see this happening, and second, sort of how is what's happening in Gaza being covered and seen in Tokyo and in Asia more generally, but in Tokyo, on the one hand, an incredible humanitarian crisis, and on the other hand, an attack on what everyone still regards as a democratic ally of the democracies, and a heinous attack at that. So how just interested in how this is covered and how central it is to the day-to-day news diet that people are consuming.
Right. So, starting from my own observation, I think it's very interesting to compare Bibi Netanyahu and Fumio Kishida. Both have very low ratings domestically, and both are taking very different strategies in regards to the US to overcome that. Kishida is embracing America, trying to reach out to both parties. Bibi is clearly waiting for Trump to come back and basically ignoring Biden. I don't know which one is going to work. If Trump does come back into office, maybe Bibi's strategy works better. So without any preconditions, I'm very interested in the different strategies. Now, on the second point, how do the Japanese look at it? I think what's important here is that America gets out of this or survives this Middle East turmoil, gets out of it in the best position. So in Japan, there was always a discussion of, wait a minute, shouldn't Taiwan be the priority? Does America have the luxury of giving arms to Ukraine, giving arms to Israel? Like especially the Patriot missiles are very crucial to the Taiwan war, but increasingly they're required in Ukraine. And if Hezbollah takes part in Israel, they're going to be needed there as well. So there was this camp that said, we should not give missiles to that cause and make a firm demand to America to prioritize Taiwan. The second camp is that no, it's important for America to win, to prevent Putin's aggression and not let Hamas get away with what they did. And by doing that, by restoring order, that becomes the best deterrence against China. And I think the second camp has won with this Kishida visit. By Kishida saying that we're global partners now, we're going to be with you when you are in Europe, when you are in the Middle East, and that's going to help us deter China. That's the message. So, to put that into reality, Japan is now going to discuss with America co-producing missiles, air defense missiles in Japan, because America has a defense industrial base capacity shortage. So Japan is offering its industrial base to fill in for that. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, no, I think that's so interesting. Just this debate that you're describing in Japan on whether we should focus on sort of making sure that we have enough to be able to focus on Taiwan and Asia versus no, we need to make sure that that we succeed everywhere because that enhances our credibility. Of course, it's exactly the same debate that is taking part mostly within the Republican Party, where there are people are saying, let's not worry about Ukraine because we need to focus on China. And those who say, well, if you don't worry about Ukraine, that will make it worse for Taiwan.
Can I just say that on that debate, one of the reasons why Japan opted for the second path to help America in Europe and Israel, that was very much influenced by your ambassador to Japan, Rahm Emanuel, a fellow Chicagoan. I just wanted to put in that.
All right, I now know that Rahm Emanuel will immediately replay this episode 100 times because anytime somebody says something nice about Rahm, His Honor, the ambassador. To all credit, and Ken just did a wonderful piece on Rahm in his paper. He's having the time of his life in more ways than one, and loves to needle the Chinese. Carla, let me just last word back to you on the situation in Gaza. I'm in Greece, as I said. I've met with Cypriots and the pier and the sea bridge will be completed by the end of the month. I've asked this question in Washington. I asked the question here. It says, it's great to get all that stuff out to the pier. How's it getting from the pier to the people who actually need it? And the answer is, we don't know. And I wonder, with much of the World Food Program, of course, UNRWA, unfunded by the United States and others, not in the territory. At its foundation, the problem here is the breakdown of governance and the breakdown of the basics of human existence, safety, security, the ability to find food and shelter. Nobody seems to be having a plan for bringing that into being. And I just wonder, are you seeing people talking about this and starting to think about how to do this? Because right now it doesn't seem to be part of the strategy.
Well, certainly, Biden gave this interview to Univision this week, and a big part of his criticism was, you just got to get the aid in, Bibi. And whether it's the near-term discussion of governance, if the Israelis want to take responsibility for what's going on the ground, they got to take responsibility for it. And the Israeli refusal to talk about governance on the day after. And Bibi refuses to talk about it now, and he refuses to talk about it later. And the Americans are pushing for it, and they are tearing their hair out.
Yeah, as Colin Powell said to George W. Bush before the invasion of Iraq, pottery barn rule, if you break it, you own it. And apparently the Israelis are in a situation where they're happy to break it. They don't want to own it. And the consequences is for those who are left behind, which unfortunately are people, children, women, men, elderly, young, whatever, who are without aid. Sad situation.
33,000. 33,000.
And 33,000 dead. And 75,000, 8,000 wounded, plus everything else. I want to thank Carla Robbins of the Council on Foreign Relations, Ken Moriyasu of Nikkei Asia, and Prashant Rao of Semaphore, all three, for really fantastic conversation. We always get back to being depressed at the end, but we did have, I think, some very uplifting and interesting conversations about what was happening in Japan and with China this week. I want to thank all of you. I want to thank those of you who are tuning in for joining us today and every day. We'll see you back in another week. And until then, have a great weekend.